My name is Boyd Larkin. I'm 58, and 3 days ago, a blood test told me the two children I raised for 20 years share none of my blood. Tonight, the town of Wallace, Idaho, packed into the firehouse bay to honor the man who fathered them, a man they call a hero, killed, pulling a child from a fire 15 years ago. The mayor read his name into the microphone. Emmett Cole gave everything for this town. I clapped. Nobody in that room knew what I'd learned. So I stood there, hands moving on their own, and decided what a dead man owed me. The folding chairs were arranged in 11 neat rows, and I had counted them without meaning to the way I count everything. Behind the mayor, someone had propped Emmett's old helmet on a velvet stand, the shield still scorched at one corner from the night he didn't come home. People wiped their eyes. A woman near the front held a photograph to her chest, like it could still breathe. I looked at the helmet and thought about char patterns, about how fire tells the truth if a man knows where to kneel. I had knelt in the wrong room for 20 years. But that isn't where this starts. It starts 3 weeks earlier on a Saturday that smelled like cut grass and transmission fluid, before I knew there was anything in my own house left to investigate. Denny had the truck's hood propped open in the driveway, elbow deep in an engine that hadn't turned over right since March. I stood beside him with my arms crossed, watching him work instead of doing it for him because that's how his hands had learned anything worth knowing. Feel for the give in that belt, I told him. Don't look at it, feel it. He rolled his eyes at me the way 21-year-olds do, then closed his eyes anyway, and felt it, and grinned when he found the slack I meant. Junie came out barefoot onto the porch steps with a glass of lemonade she hadn't offered to share, folding herself down to watch us the way she'd done since she was small enough to fit in my coat pocket. "Dad," she said, "what's the worst fire you ever worked?" She asked me some version of that question every few months, like she was building a ledger of my life one flame at a time. And I never gave her the same answer twice. I told her about the grain elevator outside Coeur d'Alene, the one that taught me dust could kill a man faster than any flame ever had. I did not tell her about the fire that made Emmett Cole a legend, because some stories in this family got told at dinner, and some got told never, and until 3 weeks ago I hadn't noticed how carefully that line had been drawn, or who had been drawing it. Corinne called us in for supper before the sun dropped behind Burke Canyon, and for a while the kitchen was just noise I loved. Denny arguing about carburetors, Junie reciting some fact about the Big Burn of 1910 she'd learned at the History Center where her mother worked. Corinne setting down a bowl of green beans like it was the only thing on her mind. I have investigated 100 houses that burned to their studs. I did not know how to read the one I was sitting in. It was Corinne who brought up the date somewhere between the beans and the coffee. She said it quiet, almost to her own plate. "Emmett's mother's anniversary is coming up. Maybe we should drive out to the cemetery this week, pay our respects." Denny nodded without looking up. Junie asked which cemetery. I said sure, of course, whatever works, because it was the kind of thing Corinne said 3 or 4 times a year, and I had long since stopped hearing the weight underneath it. What I did notice and did not think anything of at the time was the half-second her eyes held mine before she looked back down at her plate. Too long for a woman just remembering a date on a calendar, too short for me to call it anything at all. A trained man reads that pause for what it is. A husband reads it as nothing. I was that Saturday still mostly a husband. After the dishes were done, Denny went back out to the truck under the porch light, chasing that last stubborn rattle in the belt. Junie disappeared into her room with a book. Corinne washed the same pot twice, which she does when something is sitting sideways in her, though I have never once in 23 years asked her what. I sat at the kitchen table with my old case notebook, the one I still carry, though I've been half-retired 3 years, and wrote down the kind of thing I always write down: dates, small oddities, nothing that means anything until it does. I wrote C mentioned E's mother's anniversary. Watch cemetery visit gauge her mood. I underlined nothing. I closed the book and told myself it was habit, the same habit that makes a man check a stove twice, and went to bed beside my wife the way I had gone to bed beside her for 23 years, without once wondering if the floor beneath that bed was as solid as it looked. I woke a little after midnight with my chest doing something it had no business doing, a tightness that didn't belong to indigestion, a pulling low and wrong along my left arm. I lay still for a moment, cataloging it the way I catalog everything, refusing to believe the evidence, until it repeated itself. It repeated itself. Corinne woke to me gripping the headboard, and her voice went from sleep to sirens faster than I'd ever heard it move. She was the one who called it in. I remember the porch light swinging on above us, cold air on my face, Denny's bare feet slapping down the hallway, Junie's voice cracking my name in 2 syllables from somewhere I couldn't turn my head to see. I remember thinking with the small, useless clarity a man gets in the worst moments that I had spent 30 years walking into other people's disasters and had never once considered that mine would start this quietly in my own bed, in a house I thought I had already read cover to cover. The ambulance lights came up the drive, red and then blue and then red again, painting the porch, the way fire paints a wall right before the roof gives. I looked up at Corinne's face leaning over the stretcher, pale under that light, saying my name like she was afraid it was the last time she'd get to. I did not know yet that the machines waiting at Wallace General would ask my body one simple question, and that the answer would not come from my heart at all. The emergency room at Wallace General smelled the way it always does: bleach, fighting a losing battle against fear. I remember fluorescent light overhead, too white, the kind that shows a man exactly what he looks like when his own body turns on him. A nurse named Patty, who used to bring cookies to the firehouse every December, cut my shirt open without a flicker of recognition in her eyes, which told me more about how I looked than any mirror could have. Corinne stood pressed against the curtain rail, her hand finding mine, and gripping it hard enough that I felt her pulse instead of my own for a moment. Denny hovered by the foot of the bed in a t-shirt and no shoes, jaw locked tight the way it gets when he's scared and won't say so. Junie had gone quiet in the corner, arms wrapped around herself, watching the monitor's green line like she could will it steady through sheer attention. A doctor I didn't know. Young Sharp-Eyed introduced himself as Dr. Okafor, moved through the chaos with the calm of a man who'd done this 1,000 times before breakfast. He read the strip off the monitor, ordered something clipped and technical to the nurse, and told Corinne without looking up that they were watching a partial blockage and needed to move fast. Fast in that room meant a word I hadn't expected to hear about my own chest transfusion. "We'll want to check compatibility across the family while we prep him," Dr. Okafor said, already reaching for a clipboard. "Standard precaution gives us options if we need more than the bank has on hand." He said it the way a man reads off a grocery list, no weight to it at all, and I remember thinking, even flat on my back, with wires taped to my ribs, that this was the kind of detail I would have written in my own notebook without a second thought. They drew blood from all 3 of them, right there beside my bed, one after another, Denny first, because he offered before anyone asked. I watched the needle go in and thought absurdly about how many times I had watched him do harder things without flinching: pull a transmission, hold a torch. Steady stand-up, straight at his grandfather's funeral at 14. He didn't flinch now either. He just looked at me and said, "You're gonna be fine, old man," the way he always does when he's the one who's scared. Junie went next, biting her lip against the needle, glancing at me sideways the whole time, like she needed to keep checking I was still there. Corinne went last, quiet business, like the same steady hands she uses cataloging artifacts down at the History Center. Hands that had spent 20 years handling other people's histories, and never once, as far as I knew, dropping a single piece. I lay there running my own kind of inventory. Vitals, timestamps, the particular blue of the curtain, the low hum of the machine tracking my heart. It's a habit that's kept me sane through worse rooms than this one houses, with bodies still in them, rooms where the smoke hadn't finished clearing. I catalog. I don't feel not right away. Feeling comes later in the truck alone when there's nobody left to be steady for. 20 minutes passed before Dr. Okafor came back through the curtain, and something in the set of his shoulders had changed. He was carrying a folder now, instead of just a clipboard, and he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the folder, flipping back through 2 pages like he wanted to be sure before he opened his mouth. Corinne noticed it before I did. Her hand tightened around mine again, differently this time. "Mr. Larkin," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand it doesn't affect your treatment tonight either way." That's the kind of sentence a man learns to distrust in my line of work. It's the sentence you say right before you tell someone their house wasn't struck by lightning after all. I told him to go ahead. He said the cross-match results had come back faster than expected because the lab wasn't backed up tonight, and that there was an inconsistency he wanted to flag, not urgent, not dangerous, just something the paperwork required him to raise. He said the word inconsistency, the way a man says a word he's chosen very carefully, testing its weight, before he lets it out of his mouth in front of a family. I asked him what kind of inconsistency. He glanced at Corinne just for a half-second, the same kind of glance a man gives when he senses he's stepped into the middle of something he didn't mean to step into. Then he looked back down at the folder instead of at any of us and said, "The compatibility markers for 2 of my dependents didn't line up the way you'd expect, given the relationships listed on the intake form." He said it careful and clinical, the way doctors are trained to say things that could knock a man flat. He said it might be nothing, lab error, an old chart mistyped years back, a dozen boring explanations that happen every week in hospitals across this country. He said he only had to mention it because hospital policy required a note in the chart whenever markers came back, this far outside expected range. Denny asked what that meant in plain English, the way 21-year-olds ask things direct and a little defensive. Junie didn't ask anything at all. She was looking at her mother, and I noticed it even lying there with a needle in my arm and a monitor charting my heart. The particular way Junie's eyes had gone still and careful, the way a deer goes still before it decides whether to run. I looked at Corinne last. I have interviewed hundreds of people across the worst nights of their lives, watched grief and guilt and shock move across a face in ways most people never learn to read. I know the difference between a woman who is frightened for her husband and a woman who is frightened of what her husband is about to find out. In that fluorescent light, for 1/2 of 1 second, I saw the second kind. Then it was gone, smoothed back under 23 years of practice, and she was just my wife again, squeezing my hand, telling Dr. Okafor that hospital paperwork gets things wrong all the time. Everyone knew that. He nodded, said it was likely nothing, apologized for raising it at all in a moment like this, and moved on to talk about surgical scheduling, like the sentence had never left his mouth. But I am a man who has spent 30 years learning that nothing gets unsaid just because a room moves on from it. I lay there under those lights, wired to a machine that was measuring the one organ in my body I had always trusted without question, and felt something else start pulling loose, quieter than the ache in my chest, and a great deal harder to explain away. They kept me 2 nights at Wallace General for observation, running follow-up scans on a heart that turned out in the end to be more scared than damaged. Corinne slept in the vinyl chair beside my bed, both nights waking every hour to check the monitor, and I lay there in the dark, studying the shape of her against the window and thinking about nothing on purpose, the way I used to train myself to do at scene after midnight, when the smell of a bad fire got into the back of my throat and wouldn't leave. They sent me home on a Tuesday with a folder of instructions about sodium and stress and a follow-up appointment circled in red. The house looked exactly the way I'd left it. Denny's boots by the door, Junie's homework spread across the kitchen table, Corinne's reading glasses on the windowsill where they always sit. Everything in its place. That was, I think, the first thing that started to bother me. A scene that looks untouched after something has happened in it is usually the most carefully arranged scene of all. I did not say anything to anyone for 4 days. I went back to consulting part-time for the county fire marshal's office, reviewed 2 reports on a barn fire out past Mullen, sat at dinner, and asked Denny about his welding class and Junie about her college applications, and underneath every ordinary sentence I was running the same 2 words on a loop I couldn't shut off. Inconsistency. Markers. On the 5th day, I did the thing I have built my whole career on doing when a feeling won't leave me alone. I stopped trusting the feeling and went looking for evidence instead. I ordered a home kit online, the kind meant for people curious about ancestry. Nothing that would raise questions if anyone found the box in the mail. I told myself I was being thorough, not suspicious that a man in my line of work simply doesn't leave a loose thread hanging even in his own life. I collected what I needed the way I've collected evidence from 100 scenes before this one quiet, careful leaving no mark that anything had been disturbed. A cheek swab from a coffee mug Denny left in the sink. A hairbrush from Junie's bathroom that nobody would miss for one evening. I mailed the samples myself at a post office 2 towns over on my way back from a job I didn't strictly need to take. I did not examine why I chose the post office 2 towns over. A man doesn't always look directly at his own reasons. Sometimes he just follows his hands and lets them tell him later what he already knew. The waiting took 11 days. I have waited on worse things, verdicts, autopsy reports, the particular silence after a phone rings at 3 in the morning. But I don't think I have ever waited on anything that made the ordinary hours of my own life feel so much like a performance. I coached Denny through a transmission rebuild. I sat through Junie's college essay about wanting to study conservation out loud twice and told her it was good because it was. I kissed my wife goodnight every one of those 11 nights and felt each time like a man reading lines from a script someone else had written for a house that wasn't quite mine anymore. The email came on a Thursday afternoon, while I was alone in the garage, elbow deep in the same stubborn belt Denny had been chasing weeks before. My phone buzzed against the workbench. I wiped my hands on a rag before I picked it up the way I always do, because some habits don't stop, even when the whole world is about to. The subject line said, "Your results are ready." I stood there for a moment with the garage door open behind me late afternoon, light cutting gold across the concrete, and thought with the strange, useless precision a mind reaches for right before it breaks, that I had opened worse envelopes than this one, standing in worse rooms than this one, and survived every single time. I opened it. The report was clean, clinical, laid out, the way these things always are. Percentages, probability ranges, a summary line at the top that a machine somewhere had generated without knowing what it was about to do to a man's life. Denny Larkin, biological relationship to submitter excluded. Junie Larkin, biological relationship to submitter excluded. 2 words repeated twice, doing the work of 20 years undone in the time it took my eyes to move across a screen. I read it 3 times. Not because I doubted the science. I have spent 30 years trusting evidence over instinct, over hope. over every soft and human thing that wants a different answer than the one in front of it. I read it 3 times because some part of me was still standing in that fluorescent hospital room, still watching Denny roll up his sleeve without hesitation, still hearing him say, "You're gonna be fine, old man," and some part of me needed the report to blink first. It did not blink. I set the phone face down on the workbench very gently, the way you set something down when your hands have stopped entirely belonging to you. The garage was quiet, except for the tick of the engine cooling, and a single bird working somewhere out past the driveway, patient and ordinary, having no idea the world had just changed shape 3 feet away from it. I did not sit. I did not fall against the workbench the way men do in stories like this. I stood very still, the rag still in one hand, and I let the light move a little further down the wall. Somewhere in the house behind me, I could hear the television Denny and Junie arguing cheerfully over some show, the sound of 2 people who did not yet know they had just stopped, in the eyes of a laboratory 2 states away belonging to me. I listened to them a long time. I did not go inside. I did not tell Corinne. I did not tell Denny or Junie or the fire marshal's office or the dashboard of my own truck, though I sat in it more than once that week with the engine off and my hands on the wheel, saying nothing to no one. 3 days passed that way. I have kept harder secrets than this in my time. Evidence not yet ready for a courtroom, a cause of death, a family wasn't prepared to hear, but I had never once kept a secret from inside my own house. And it turns out that's a different kind of weight entirely. I went through the motions the way a man goes through motions when he doesn't trust himself to do anything else. I reviewed a barn fire report and found 2 contradictions in the initial statement that I would have caught blind drunk a year ago, and caught neither of them until my second read. I sat across from Denny at the kitchen table while he explained a wiring diagram for his welding class, nodding at the right places, hearing perhaps 1 word in 4. I watched Junie practice her college interview answers in the hallway mirror, and told her she sounded confident, which was true, and said nothing else, which was not like me at all. On the second evening, Denny came out to the garage while I was doing nothing in particular with a wrench I didn't need, and asked me straight out if something was wrong with my heart. He meant whether the doctors had missed something on the scans. He stood there in the doorway with his hands jammed in his pockets, 21 years old, and looking for 1 unguarded second, exactly the way he'd looked at 7, waiting to find out if I was going to be all right. I told him the truth as far as it went, that my heart was fine, that the doctors said so, that he didn't need to worry. I watched something in his shoulders come down an inch when I said it, relief he'd earned honestly, built on half of what I knew and none of what I couldn't say yet. I have never in my life felt lower giving a boy good news. At night, I lay beside Corinne and let my mind go back to a stretch of years I had not visited on purpose in a long while. The summer I turned 37, when the fire season out past the Bitterroots ran 9 weeks straight, and I was gone more nights than I was home. I remembered it the way I remember old case files in fragments arranged by relevance rather than order. The ash smell that never fully left my gear. The 2-minute phone calls from motel parking lots. Corinne's voice on the other end, thinner each week, though I hadn't let myself hear it thin at the time. One night in particular kept surfacing uninvited, no matter how many times I tried to file it back where it belonged. I had come home for 11 hours, between shifts, smelling of smoke I couldn't wash out fast enough, and found the porch light burning at 2 in the morning, and Emmett's truck parked crooked in the drive like he'd left in a hurry. Corinne was at the kitchen table when I came in, a cup of coffee gone cold in front of her, and she told me Denny had spiked a fever that scared her, that Emmett had driven her and the baby to the clinic in Kellogg, because my truck was the one with the good tires, and hers wouldn't start. I remember standing in the doorway in my turnout boots, still half a stranger to my own kitchen, thanking God out loud that somebody had been there. I remember Emmett standing up from the table to shake my hand before he left, and how tired he looked, and how I never once asked him why. I remembered Emmett driving out to check on her twice that summer, because that's what a man does for his crew. Chief's wife, when the crew chief can't get home, brings in firewood, fixes a fence post, sits at the kitchen table for coffee, and leaves before dark. I remembered being grateful for it. I remembered telling him so, clapping him on the shoulder at the station, saying something like, "Glad somebody's looking after my girls while I'm out here," and meaning every word of it, and feeling nothing underneath the words but relief. Denny had not even been born yet that first spring I was thinking of, or he had just barely a few months old and colicky, and I had missed more of his crying nights than I'd ever admitted to myself, keeping score. A man can build a very comfortable story out of the gaps he doesn't examine. I had built mine over 20 years without once checking the foundation, the way I'd tell any homeowner to check theirs, the way I never once thought to check my own. I did not let myself finish that particular memory. I have learned across 30 years of standing in burned rooms exactly how far a man can walk into a piece of his own past before it stops being useful and starts being something else entirely, before the reconstruction turns from evidence gathering into a different kind of fire, one that doesn't need fuel from the outside, because it's already got plenty on the inside. I felt myself get close to that line, somewhere around 3 in the morning on the second night, and I pulled back the way I've trained myself to pull back from any scene that isn't safe to walk through alone yet. So I didn't walk through it. I let it stand there half-lit the way a room stands half-lit when you've only got one flashlight and 100 more rooms left to check before morning. I turned over, matched my breathing to Corinne's the way I'd matched it for 23 years, and told myself I would go back to that summer later when I had more to stand on than a lab report and a feeling I couldn't yet prove. Junie noticed something too in her own quieter way. On the third night, she left a note tucked under my coffee mug before school, nothing dramatic, just 3 words in her looping handwriting. "You okay, Dad?" I stood at the counter a long moment holding that note, the same counter where Corinne had set down green beans, like nothing in the world was wrong 3 weeks before any of this started. I wrote back in the small space left on the paper, "Just tired. Love you." It wasn't a lie. It also wasn't the truth. And I have spent 30 years teaching young investigators the difference between those two things matters more than almost anything else in this world. 3 days passed, like that quiet, careful a man walking through his own life on a floor he no longer trusted. On the 4th morning, Corinne came into the kitchen, already dressed, car keys in hand, and reminded me gently that tonight was the night. The town was holding the 15-year memorial down at the firehouse for Emmett. She said his name the way she always said it, easy, familiar, a name that had lived comfortably in our kitchen for 15 years, without once sounding like anything other than what it was supposed to be. I told her I remembered. I told her I'd be ready by 6. I did not tell her that somewhere in the last 3 days, without meaning to, I had started keeping a second notebook in my head, one with her name at the top of it. Instead of a case number 1, I had no idea yet how I was going to close. 6 o'clock arrived, the way appointments arrive when you'd rather they didn't, punctual, unbothered by the state of the man waiting on them. I stood in front of the bedroom mirror, knotting a tie I hadn't worn since Denny's welding certification ceremony, watching my own hands do a job they'd done 1,000 times, without once needing supervision, and thought about how strange it is that a body can keep performing its small, competent rituals, while the rest of a man has come completely apart, somewhere out of sight. Corinne called up the stairs that she couldn't find the good frame, the one with Emmett's photo they meant to bring for the memorial table, some collage the town committee had asked families to contribute to. I told her I'd check the hall closet where we keep the boxes nobody opens more than once a year, Christmas ornaments and old report cards, and the particular clutter a family accumulates without ever quite deciding to keep it. The closet smelled the way it always does, cedar and dust and the particular must of cardboard that sat too long in a house through too many winters. I pulled down 3 boxes before I found the right one, and in the process, handled a decade of things I hadn't thought about in years. Denny's Little League trophy with the gold paint chipping off the batter's arm, a Christmas card from Corinne's mother, postmarked the year before she passed, a stack of Junie's spelling bee ribbons rubber-banded together like they still mattered to somebody. A house tells you who it belongs to if you dig deep enough. I had spent 30 years telling other people that. I had never once applied it to my own front hall closet. I found the frame in the second box, wedged between a stack of Junie's grade school art projects and a manila envelope I didn't recognize, soft with age at the corners. I set the frame aside on the hallway floor, and out of the same habit that has never once let me leave a scene without checking every drawer, opened the envelope instead of just moving past it. Photographs. A dozen or more loose, the kind of pictures nobody had bothered to put in an album because they weren't the important ones. Birthday candles, a fishing trip, somebody's dog I didn't remember owning. I flipped through them the way you flip through anything familiar, expecting nothing, which is exactly the state of mind in which a man is least prepared for what he finds next. It was Emmett in the backyard, late spring, by the look of the lilacs behind him, holding an infant against his shoulder with the particular stiff-armed tenderness of a man, not entirely sure how to hold something that small. Denny. I knew the onesie yellow, a duck stitched on the front one Corinne had kept in a drawer for years, after he outgrew it, sentimental about it, in a way she wasn't sentimental about much else. I had never once wondered why. I have looked at thousands of photographs in my career, trained myself to read a face the way other men read a paragraph, what a person's eyes are doing when they think no one important is watching them do it. Emmett was not smiling at the camera in that picture. He was looking down at Denny with an expression I had filed away, without meaning to, the very first time I saw it on my own face the day Junie was born. It is not an expression a man wears for somebody else's child. I know that now with a certainty that has nothing to do with laboratories. I have stood over enough scenes in my life to know that a single photograph rarely tells the whole story by itself. A man's expression can be misread. A moment can be caught wrong. And I have seen careers ruined by investigators who trusted one frame of film over the full weight of context. I told myself that sitting there on the hallway floor, the way I would have told any junior man on my crew who wanted to close a case too fast. It didn't help. Some evidence doesn't need corroboration. Some evidence a man simply recognizes the way he recognizes his own handwriting or the sound of his own front door. I sat down on the hallway floor, still holding the photograph. My good shirt already collecting dust from a closet I didn't visit often enough to keep clean. Somewhere behind me, Corinne called down that she'd found her earrings, that we should leave in 10 minutes if we wanted a decent parking spot near the firehouse. Her voice was light. It had been light for 21 years about exactly this. I turned the photograph over. The way I turn over every piece of evidence before I trust the front of it, and found a date penciled faintly on the back. In handwriting I recognized as Emmett's own, careless and slanted, the same hand that used to scrawl shift notes on the station whiteboard. The date sat there in soft, graphite, plain as anything, telling me nothing I could have used in a courtroom, and everything I needed to know standing alone in my own hallway. I did not show it to Corinne. I did not confront her on the stairs in her good dress with her earrings half in 10 minutes before we were due to stand in a room full of people who loved a dead man for reasons that were about to mean something different to me than they meant to anyone else there. I have built a career on knowing the difference between the moment you have enough to act and the moment you only have enough to suspect. And I was, God help me, still enough of an investigator that night to know which one I was standing in. I folded the photograph once carefully along a crease that would not damage the image and slid it into the inside pocket of my jacket against my chest, close to whatever was left of my heart after that week. I picked the frame back up off the floor, straightened my tie one more time in the hall mirror, and called back to Corinne that I was ready, that we shouldn't keep the town waiting on a night like this. We drove to the firehouse in near silence, her hand resting light on my knee, the way it had 100 times before mine. Steady on the wheel, the way it always was, both of us performing a marriage. Neither of us knew the other one had already started grieving. Outside, Wallace slid by in the early dark. The hardware store, the old depot, the church where we'd married 23 years ago, every building exactly where I'd left it that morning. None of them looking one bit different for what I now carried folded against my ribs. Denny and Junie followed behind us in Denny's truck headlights washing steady in my rear view the whole drive down Bank Street. I watched them in the mirror more than I watched the road, some part of me needing to keep them in sight, the way a man keeps a hand on something he's afraid might slip. Junie had her window cracked, despite the cold, her arm resting on the frame the way she does when she's thinking hard about something. And I wondered, not for the first time that week, how much of what a father does gets written into a child, regardless of what runs in their blood. We turned onto 6th Street, where the firehouse bay doors stood open, and lit cars already lining both sides of the block, and I felt the photograph shift slightly against my chest as I reached to unbuckle my seatbelt, a small weight, paper-thin, heavier than anything I had carried out of a burning building in 30 years of walking into them. The bay doors were thrown open wide enough to fit the whole town engine trucks pushed back against the rear wall and draped with black and gold bunting folding chairs, set out in careful rows across the concrete where I'd once helped hose down blood after a bad wreck on Route 4. I shook 11 hands, walking from the parking lot to my seat. Men I'd worked calls with, women who'd brought casseroles to this house more times than I could count, all of them saying some version of "good to see you." Boyd Heart of Gold showing up for this even after your own scare. None of them knew which scare I was actually carrying. Corinne sat beside me in the second row, Denny and Junie just behind us, and I watched her smooth her skirt twice before the program even started a small, unconscious motion I had seen her make maybe 1,000 times in 23 years without once wondering what it meant. Tonight I wondered. I cataloged it the way I catalog everything now and hated myself a little for doing it in a room built to honor grief, not to investigate it. Junie leaned forward between our chairs before the mayor started whispering that she'd written a short piece about Emmett for her AP history class last spring. Something about local heroes and civic memory, and that Mrs. Redfern at the History Center, Corinne's own boss, had helped her track down old newspaper clippings for it. She said it proudly, the way a girl says something she's genuinely pleased with, and I told her that was a fine thing to have done and meant it. Even as some new and ugly part of my mind noted that she had spent an afternoon of her senior year researching her own father, without either of us knowing it. Mayor Halloway took the podium at 7 sharp, a heavy-set man with a voice built for outdoor rallies, and thanked the town for turning out 15 years running to remember a man half of Wallace still called by his first name, like he might walk back through the bay doors any minute. Behind him on a velvet stand under the trophy lights sat Emmett's old helmet, the shield scorched at one corner from the fire that took him, the same fire the county still teaches rookies about, the one where he went back in twice for a boy trapped on the 2nd floor and only came out once. The mayor read from a page he'd clearly read from before, the words worn smooth with repetition. He talked about sacrifice, about the particular kind of man this county doesn't make, as often as it used to, about a scholarship fund that had put 4 Wallace kids through fire academy since Emmett's death. Then he said it, the line I'd heard he always closed, with the one that would have meant nothing to me 8 days ago and meant everything to me now. Emmett Cole gave everything for this town. I clapped. Everyone clapped. Denny clapped hardest of anyone in our row, and I watched his hands come together with a kind of unguarded feeling that had nothing performed in it at all, a boy honoring a story he'd grown up believing the same way he believed the sun came up over Burke Canyon every morning, because that's simply what it did. Nobody in that bay knew what I'd learned 3 days before in my own garage. I stood there in my good coat, with a folded photograph pressed flat against my chest, and decided somewhere in that applause what a dead man owed me. A slideshow followed photographs of Emmett projected against the white cinder block wall, Emmett at the Academy young, and grinning Emmett at some long-ago county fair with his arm slung around a much younger Mayor Halloway Emmett, standing in front of Engine 3, the year it was new. I watched them cycle past the way you watch weather come in, unable to look away and unable to feel anything you could name cleanly. Corinne did not look at the wall. She looked at her hands, folded very still in her lap through the entire slideshow, and I noticed that too, filed it beside the skirt smoothing and the coffee cup pause from the hospital building, a case file I had never asked to open. The room went quiet for the traditional moment of silence, the whole bay still, except for the low hum of the overhead lights and somebody's toddler fussing near the back doors. I used the silence the way I use every quiet moment now. Not for grief, not yet, but for observation. I watched the crowd instead of bowing my head. I watched the fire chief standing rigid by the engine bay, watched 2 of the younger volunteers wipe their eyes without embarrassment, watched Corinne's folded hands go white-knuckled for exactly as long as the silence lasted, and then release all at once. The second Mayor Halloway cleared his throat to end it. Afterward, there was coffee and sheet cake in the equipment bay. The whole town shuffling into the informal half of grief, the way small towns always do. Memory sliding easy into small talk. I stood near the door with a paper cup I didn't drink from watching Denny across the room, and it was there in the middle of all that low, friendly noise that the detail found me instead of the other way around. Corinne worked the room the way she always does at these things, moving from cluster to cluster with a plate of cake. She never quite got around to eating, hugging people, laughing softly at some story old Hollis was telling about Emmett and a stuck ladder truck back in '98. She was good at this, had always been good at this, and I stood at the edge of it watching a woman perform 23 years of practiced grace over a grief that was I now understood. Not entirely the grief everyone else in that room believed they were sharing with her. Denny was talking to old Hollis Reardon, who'd run the volunteer squad, back when Emmett was chief, and something in the conversation made Denny laugh, a real laugh, head tipped back slightly, one hand coming up to rub the back of his own neck the exact same way, at the exact same angle that I had watched Emmett do 1,000 times across 30 years of shift changes and slow afternoons at this very station. I had never once noticed it on Denny before that moment. I do not know if it was always there, and I had simply never been looking for it, or if a boy can somehow inherit a gesture the way he inherits nothing else from a man he has never once been told is his father. I stood very still with my cold coffee in my hand and watched my son laugh with a dead man's hands in a room built to celebrate that dead man's memory, and understood with a clarity that had nothing gentle in it at all that I was no longer looking for evidence. I already had it. Everywhere I looked in that bay, I had it. I did not sleep that night, or the 2 after it. I lay beside Corinne with my eyes closed and my mind running the way it runs at 3 in the morning. After a bad scene, replaying, reordering, looking for the detail I might have filed wrong the first time through. On the third night, I gave up pretending and went down to the kitchen table with my old case notebook, the same one that had sat closed on the nightstand through 11 days of waiting for a lab report, and opened it to a fresh page for the first time in years. I want to be honest about something, because honesty is the only thing that has ever made my work worth anything. I sat there with a pen in my hand and asked myself out loud in an empty kitchen whether I was building a case or building a story. Grief does that to a man. So does anger, and I had plenty of both circling somewhere under the surface, however carefully I kept them out of my hands. A photograph with a date on the back is not proof of anything by itself. A boy's gesture is not proof of anything at all. Sons pick up mannerisms from every man who spends enough time around them. Coaches, uncles, family friends. I have sat across the table from investigators who wanted a conclusion so badly, they built the evidence to fit it. And I have watched what that does to a case, and to the men who build it that way. I did not want to become one of them, even in my own kitchen, even about my own life. So I did the only thing I know how to do when a feeling won't hold up to its own weight. I went looking for something that couldn't lie to me the way a photograph or a gesture could a record. Something with a timestamp kept by somebody who had no idea 21 years ago that it would ever matter to anyone. I still have consulting access to the county fire archive, a courtesy the marshal's office extends to retired investigators who help review old cases. And among those archives sit the duty rosters, every shift, every call-out, every man's hours logged going back to before I ever pinned on a badge. I told myself I was simply confirming a timeline, the same neutral language I'd use walking a junior investigator through any records pull. I drove out to the county annex the next morning. Before Corinne was awake, sat down at the same microfiche machine I'd used 100 times for actual arson cases, and pulled the roster for the summer I turned 37. It took most of the morning. Fire season records from that era aren't digitized clean, some of it handwritten, some of it typed on a machine that dropped its lowercase e's pages. I had to cross-reference against my own memory of which crew I'd been running with and where. But records don't get tired, and records don't decide halfway through that they'd rather not know the answer. I built the picture one shift at a time, the way I've built 100 other pictures, patient, unhurried, letting the data tell me what it wanted to tell me, instead of the other way around. What it told me was this. Across the 11 weeks, I'd logged the heaviest overtime of my career, chasing that fire season through the Bitterroots. Emmett Cole's own shift rotation had been altered 4 separate times, swapped, traded, rearranged with 3 different men who signed off on covering for him in a pattern that put him off duty and unaccounted for on 11 of the exact nights I was logged as gone from Wallace. 11 nights. Not 2, the way memory had softened it down to in the version I'd told myself for 20 years. 11. I sat at that machine a long time after I found the pattern, watching the pale blue light of the screen, the way I have watched 100 other screens deliver a verdict a room wasn't ready for. I have built my whole reputation on the idea that a record like this one closes a question rather than opens it. It did not feel that way sitting alone in a county annex at 9 in the morning, with nobody around to see a man's hands go still on a keyboard. It felt like the record had opened a door I was going to have to walk through by myself with nobody's help in a case where I could never once be the objective investigator I have spent 30 years training myself to be. A clerk. I half knew a woman named Dolores who'd worked that annex longer than I'd been in the county, came by around 10 with a stack of files for another drawer, and asked kindly if I was finding what I needed. I told her I was just closing out some old paperwork, before it got lost to time, the same lie I'd been telling everyone for over a week. Now smooth as anything, and she nodded and moved on without a second thought. Because why would she think anything else? I have told the truth for a living my whole career. I did not know until that week how easily the other thing comes when a man needs it to. I printed what I needed. The rosters, the swap authorizations, the dates lined up clean against Denny's birth certificate. And later that same morning, against a second document I had no trouble pulling once I knew exactly what I was looking for. I did not print the second document to torture myself. I printed it because a case isn't a case until you can lay every piece of it on the same table and see whether it holds together as one story or falls apart into several. This one held together. God help me, it held together perfectly. I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat, and somewhere on Route 4, at the exact bend where I'd hosed blood off the pavement 2 decades ago, after a wreck that had nothing to do with any of this, I made a decision I have not been able to unmake since. I was done being a husband about this. A husband forgives too fast or breaks too hard or spends himself out on feeling before he's earned the right to act on anything. I needed, for however long it took, to be the other thing. I know how to be the man who walks into a burned house and does not leave until the walls have told him the truth, whatever that truth costs the people who have to keep living in what's left standing. I pulled into the driveway, sat with the engine off for a long moment, the way I had sat there so many nights that week, and opened my notebook one more time. I wrote a single line at the top of a fresh page, the kind of line I write to open every real investigation I've ever run, the kind that tells me I have stopped speculating and started working. Case opened, subject my own life, investigator of record me whether I like it or not. I closed the notebook, gathered the folder off the passenger seat, and went inside to a house that still believed, as far as anyone in it knew, that I had simply gone out early to review some old fire report. The Wallace Historical Center sits 2 blocks off Main Street, a converted assay office from the mining days, with brick walls a foot thick and a bronze plaque out front, commemorating the big burn survivors who rebuilt this town from ash in 1910. Corinne has worked there 11 years, curating the collection that tells Wallace's own version of itself, back to every tourist who wanders in off the highway, a version I understood now with at least one exhibit missing. I told her that morning I had a few hours free before an afternoon consult with the marshal's office, and that I'd stop by the center on my way, maybe look through the old newspaper archive for a case reference I needed. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did need to look through an archive. I simply hadn't told her which one or what I was actually hunting for inside it. She looked pleased when I walked in. The genuine, uncomplicated pleasure of a woman glad to see her husband show interest in her work, and that expression on her face very nearly stopped me at the door. I have interrogated men who did terrible things and still managed in unguarded moments to look entirely like themselves, like the person their own mother would have recognized. I understood watching Corinne cross the room toward me with her reading glasses pushed up into her hair. The people are never only the worst thing they've done. That understanding did not make the morning any easier. I told her I was fine finding my own way to the microfilm room, and she let me go, distracted almost immediately by a school group filing in for a tour, 24th graders in matching field trip shirts, asking loud questions about mining lanterns. I watched her fall into her teaching voice, warm and patient, explaining to a boy in the front row why the miners carried canaries, and thought about how many versions of a person a single day can hold without any of them being false. The microfilm room at the center keeps a fuller run of the old Wallace miner press than the county annex does, going back past the turn of the last century, and buried somewhere in the community pages of a summer 21 years gone, I found what I'd actually come looking for: a photograph. I remembered vaguely a 4th of July picnic at Kellogg Lake. The newspaper had run a half-page spread on families spread across the grass. Volunteer firefighters manning the grill in matching t-shirts. I found Corinne in it, 7 months, along with Junie sitting on a blanket. I found Emmett beside her, close enough that a stranger looking at that photograph 21 years later might read it several different ways. None of them provable, all of them now unmistakable to me. I sat with that photograph on the screen a long time, the fluorescent hum of the microfilm machine the only sound in the small back room, and did the thing I have trained myself to do at every scene that threatens to overwhelm the investigator standing in it. I named what I was looking at out loud, very quietly, the way I'd narrate evidence for a report. A pregnant woman. A family friend seated close. A photograph that proves nothing on its own, and everything in the context of everything else I now carried, folded in a growing file at home. I scrolled further through that summer's issues, half hoping to find something that would undo what I'd already seen, and found instead a small item from a week later, a notice that the Volunteer Fire Auxiliary's annual picnic committee had been chaired that year, the paper noted by Emmett Cole and Corinne Larkin, working together on logistics for the town's 4th of July event 3 years running. I had known that once, the vague way a man knows the furniture of his own marriage without examining a single piece of it. I had simply never asked why my wife spent 3 consecutive summers organizing a town picnic beside a man who was not her husband, while her actual husband fought a fire out past the bitter roots that never seemed to end. I left before Corinne finished her tour, slipping out past the gift shop, while she was still crouched at the front of a cluster of 9-year-olds, letting them each hold a genuine miner's pickaxe under careful supervision. She did not see me go. I stood outside on the sidewalk for a moment afterward, the cold October air doing nothing at all to settle whatever was moving through my chest, and thought that I had spent the morning watching my wife be good at her life, and had left it feeling worse, not better, for having witnessed it. The consult that afternoon went the way most of my consults go: a barn fire outside Mullen, a straightforward electrical cause, nothing that taxed me the way it should have. I caught myself twice giving the same answer to a question the marshal's deputy had already asked, and once staring at a wall of char-pattern photographs without actually seeing any of them. He asked if I was feeling all right, given the heart scare, and I told him I was fine, tired, nothing more. I have told that particular lie so many times in the last 2 weeks that I've started to wonder if it's the only sentence left in me that comes out smooth. Denny called around 4 to ask if I wanted to grab dinner with him and a friend from the welding program, something easy. And I told him not tonight, that I had some paperwork to finish up. I heard the small disappointment in his voice before he covered it quick and practiced the exact way I'd trained him, without meaning to swallow it, fast. Don't make anybody feel bad for saying no to you. I hung up the phone and sat in my truck in the marshal's parking lot for 10 minutes before I could make myself drive home, hating for the first time in this whole ordeal some specific and unbearable version of myself. Junie texted not long after a photo of a college acceptance portal she'd just refreshed for the 5th time that day. Still waiting, capped off with 3 exclamation points about how nervous she was. I typed back that I was proud of her, no matter what that portal said, and meant every word, and sat there afterward, thinking about how strange it was to feel that kind of uncomplicated love for a child at the exact same hour I was carrying proof that the love itself might rest on a foundation neither of us had ever agreed to. I drove home slow, the long way past the turnoff to the cemetery and past the firehouse with its bay doors shut for the night, letting the last of the daylight burn down over Burke Canyon while I tried and failed to build in my head some version of the conversation that wouldn't end with everything I loved on fire. There isn't one. I have never once in 30 years of delivering hard news to families standing in the wreckage of their own homes found a version of the truth that doesn't cost something on the way out of a man's mouth. The kitchen light was on when I pulled into the driveway. Through the window, I could see Corinne at the counter, an apron on humming something I couldn't hear from the truck chopping vegetables for a dinner. She had no idea I wasn't going to be able to eat. I sat there with the engine off for longer than I should have, the folder on the passenger seat beside me heavier than any evidence file I had ever carried into any room in my life. And then I got out, walked up the porch steps I had walked up 10,000 times before, and opened the door into my own kitchen for what I already understood would be the last ordinary evening either of us would ever have in it. Corinne looked up when I came through the door, wooden spoon still in her hand, and whatever she saw on my face made her set it down slowly on the cutting board instead of finishing the motion she'd started. I have watched that particular kind of stillness settle over 100 people across 30 years, the moment a body understands ahead of the mind that the room has already changed shape. I set the folder on the kitchen table between us, squared it the way I square every piece of evidence before I open a conversation I can't take back. I did not raise my voice. I have never once needed to raise my voice to get at the truth of a thing, and I was not going to start in my own kitchen over my own life, with the only woman I had ever loved standing across from me in an apron she'd put on 20 minutes earlier, believing this was still an ordinary Tuesday. "I need you to sit down," I said. She didn't. She stood at the counter with both hands flat against it, watching me open the folder, watching me lay out the duty roster, the swap authorizations, the photograph from the picnic, the second photograph from the closet, one piece at a time, the way I have laid out evidence in front of 100 people who were about to stop being who they thought they were. I did not accuse her. I have learned across 30 years that a good investigator doesn't need to accuse anyone of anything. He only needs to lay the truth down in the right order and let it do the work a raised voice never could. I told her plainly what the blood test showed. I told her what the photographs showed. I asked her once to tell me the rest herself because I had earned that much, and so I thought, had she the chance to say it in her own words, instead of having it read back to her like a verdict. The silence after I asked lasted longer than any silence I have ever sat through in my life, and I have sat through the kind that follows a knock on a stranger's door at 3 a.m. to tell them their house and everything in it is gone. Then Corinne came around the counter, pulled out a kitchen chair, and sat down across from me the way a woman sits when her legs have simply stopped being willing to hold her up any longer. She did not reach for my hand. She did not cry, not at first. She looked at the photographs on the table for a long moment, and then she told me. She told me about the summer I was gone 11 weeks, about coming home from the clinic that night, with Denny burning up with fever, and no one to drive her because my truck had the good tires and hers wouldn't start. And how Emmett had been the one who came the way he always came, quietly, without being asked twice. She told me it hadn't started that night. She told me it had started slow, over months of small kindnesses that neither of them had named honestly to themselves, until it was already too late to stop calling it what it was. She told me Emmett had wanted to tell me more than once, in the years after, that it had eaten at him in a way she hadn't fully understood, until much later that the man this whole town called a hero had spent his last years walking around Wallace carrying a truth he couldn't put down and couldn't say out loud, not to protect himself, but because by then Denny was walking and talking and calling me Dad in a voice that broke something in both of them every time they heard it. She told me Emmett went into that fire the way he went into every fire, and that some nights she had let herself believe in the ugliest corner of her grief, that some part of him had stopped being careful on purpose. I did not ask her if that was true. Some questions don't have answers a living person is equipped to give about a dead man's last 30 seconds inside a burning house. I have stood in enough of those houses myself to know better than to go looking for an answer fire never leaves behind. She told me she had meant every single year since to find the courage to tell me, and had watched the window for it close a little further every year that passed, smaller when Denny turned 10, smaller still when Junie asked me at 7 to teach her to fish the way I'd taught Denny, smaller than anything, by the time both of them were grown enough that the truth would not just break a marriage, but unmake two entire people's understanding of who they were. She said she was sorry, in a voice that had nothing performed in it at all, the plainest, least defended thing she had said to me in 23 years, and I believed every word of it, and it did not change a single fact sitting on that table between us. I sat there a long moment after she finished running my hands flat against the surface of the table, the way I run my hands over a scene before I let myself say anything about what it means. I did not shout. I did not throw anything or slam a door or ask her the question every man in every story like this one is supposed to ask, how could you? I already knew how. Loneliness is not a mystery. It has never once been a mystery in any house I've ever investigated, including my own. Corinne did not ask me to stay. I noticed that even in the wreckage of that kitchen, the way I notice everything, that she did not reach for my sleeve, did not say the word please, did not offer me any version of a bargain a lesser woman might have reached for in that moment. She sat very straight in her chair with her hands folded on the table beside the folder, watching me the way a person watches whether they know they can't argue with, and something in that stillness told me she had already, somewhere in the 11 days since I'd come home from the hospital, different, made her own kind of peace with losing me. She did not say that either. She did not have to. I have spent 30 years reading what people don't say, and what Corinne didn't say sitting there was the loudest thing in that kitchen. I stood up. I did not look at her when I did it, because I did not trust what my face would do if I did, and some part of me even then did not want her last honest sight of me to be that. I walked to the door, took my coat off the hook by habit rather than intention, and stepped out into the cold without a single word, leaving the folder open on the table behind me for her to sit with alone, the way I had been sitting with all of it alone for 11 days already. The porch light buzzed faintly overhead, the way it always does in the first hard cold of October. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at nothing, 3 short notes and silence over and over. The air smelled like wood smoke from somebody's chimney, and the wet mineral cold that comes down off Burke Mountain this time of year, familiar in a way that felt almost cruel, the whole town going on exactly as it always had, while I stood on my own porch steps and breathed it in, out. Not moving, not speaking, not yet fully, a man who knew what came next. I did not go back inside that night. I sat in the truck for a long while, then drove to the only place in Wallace that made sense at that hour, the marshal's office, where I still keep a key and a cot in the back room from the years I used to work overnight arson watches. I told myself it was temporary, a few days to think clearly, the kind of professional distance I'd recommend to anyone in the middle of an active investigation who couldn't yet trust his own judgment near the evidence. I did not examine too closely how much of that reasoning was true, and how much was simply the only sentence I could stand to tell myself. Corinne did not call. I don't know if that was mercy or exhaustion or some combination of the two, but the silence between us held for 3 days, broken only by a single text on the second morning. Denny and Junie are asking where you are. I told them work called you out to Coeur d'Alene. I am not going to lie to them again after this, but I thought you should get to choose when. I read that message a dozen times, standing in the marshal's kitchenette with a cup of bad coffee going cold in my hand, and understood that she had just handed me something I had not expected from her that night in the kitchen. A kind of grace I did not feel I had earned the right to receive. Those 3 nights on the cot were the first nights in 23 years I had slept entirely alone, and I did not sleep well. I lay in the dark, listening to the building settle, the old radiator ticking somewhere down the hall, and ran the same argument with myself over and over, that I owed Denny and Junie the truth immediately, that I owed them time to keep believing in the life they'd always known just a little longer, that both of those things could not possibly be right. And yet both of them felt at 3 in the morning entirely true. I have investigated fires my whole career by finding the single point of origin. I could not for the life of me find one here. There wasn't a single point. There were 21 years of them. The scholarship dedication had been on the town calendar for a month before any of this started, and I could not find a version of skipping it that didn't announce to a town that reads its own silences as carefully as I read a scene that something had gone badly wrong in the Larkin house. So I went. I put on the same coat I'd worn to the memorial, drove to the high school gymnasium where they'd set up folding chairs and a podium beneath a new bronze plaque, the Emmett Cole Memorial Fire Science Scholarship, established in honor of a Wallace hero, and took a seat near the back, hoping distance might do for me what composure could not. It did not. Mayor Halloway found me before the ceremony started, clapped a hand on my shoulder, and asked if I'd say a few words on behalf of the department, the way I had at every one of these things for 15 years, running my standing in this town, built in no small part on exactly that kind of easy trustworthiness. I told him I hadn't prepared anything. He said that was fine. Nobody expected polish, just a few honest words from a man everybody in that gym respected. I have never in my life heard a sentence I wanted less to be true about myself. I walked up when he called my name. I looked out at a gymnasium full of people who believed without one flicker of doubt that they were about to hear a grieving friend speak plainly about a man who deserved every ounce of the town's love. I found Denny and Junie in the 3rd row. Denny in his good jacket. Junie leaning forward slightly the way she does when she wants to be proud of something I'm about to say. I did not look for Corinne. I knew without checking exactly where she was sitting, and exactly what it would cost me to meet her eyes in that room. I spoke for perhaps 90 seconds. I do not fully remember the words now, only that I built them the careful way I build a report when I know some of what's in it can never be printed true in every sentence, complete in none of them. I said Emmett Cole understood better than most men what it costs to run toward the thing everyone else is running away from. I said this scholarship would send kids through the academy who'd never otherwise have the chance. And that was a legacy worth more than most men managed to leave behind in twice the years he got. Every word of it was true. I have never told a bigger lie in my life than the sum of those true sentences standing at that podium, looking out at my own children, clapping for the truth they still believed they were hearing. I sat back down and let the rest of the ceremony wash past me. The first scholarship recipient named a shy sophomore from the class below Junie's, tearful and grateful at the podium, utterly unaware of what she now owed her education to. I clapped when everyone clapped. I shook the hands I was expected to shake on the way out, told Hollis Reardon it was a fine turnout, told the sophomore's mother I was proud of her boy, and drove home alone in the dark, with the taste of every one of those careful half-truths still sitting on my tongue like ash. The porch light was on when I pulled in, same as it had been the night everything broke open, And for a moment, the familiarity of it nearly undid something in my chest. I'd been holding steady all evening. I let myself in quietly, not wanting to wake anyone if the house had already gone to sleep, and found Denny in the front hallway instead pulling his boots off after getting in himself, still in the jacket he'd worn to the ceremony. It wasn't his good jacket. I saw that clearly under the hall light, in a way I hadn't across a crowded gymnasium. It was older, a size too broad in the shoulders, a faded canvas work coat with a small burn scar melted into the left cuff that I recognized the instant my eyes found it. Because I had watched that exact scar happen 20-some years ago at a training exercise where Emmett had leaned a fraction too close to a controlled burn and laughed it off after wear and tear, boys, comes with the job. Corinne must have given it to him years back, some hand-me-down from a family friend's closet, one more small, unremarkable kindness threaded so deep into our life that nobody had ever once thought to ask where it came from. Denny caught me staring and grinned, oblivious, shrugging one shoulder like he was modeling it for me. Found this in the hall closet last year, figured nobody wanted it anymore. Warm as anything. I told him it looked good on him. I meant God help me every terrible layer of that sentence. And I climbed the stairs to a bed I was no longer sure I belonged in, carrying a truth that had just put its hands, quite literally, on my son's shoulders. The Wallace Cemetery sits on a terraced hillside above town, laid out in the 1880s when the mining families first needed somewhere permanent to put their dead, and Emmett's grave sits in the newer section, near the top, close enough to the tree line that pine needles drift across the granite most of the year. I had been there twice before, once for the burial, once for the 5-year marker, when the department dedicated a small brass plaque at the base of the stone. I had not been back in the 10 years since, not out of avoidance exactly, just the ordinary drift of a life too full to make room for a grave that didn't ask anything of me. It asked something of me now. I drove up on a gray Sunday morning while Corinne told the kids I'd gone in early to review a case, another true sentence doing the work of a lie, and parked at the bottom of the hill because something in me didn't want the sound of an engine anywhere near what I was about to do. I walked the rest of the way up, boots crunching on frost-hardened grass, and found the stone exactly where I remembered it. Emmett Roy Cole. And beneath it, the dates, and beneath those, a line the department had chosen at the funeral that I had helped select myself back when I still believed I knew the whole man it described. He gave everything he had. I stood there a long time without saying anything at all. I do not know exactly what I expected. Some flood of rage, maybe the kind you see men perform in movies, shouting at a stone that can't shout back. It didn't come. What came instead was quieter and worse, a kind of conversation I found myself having anyway in my own head, with a man who had spent the last 15 years being every bit as dead as this stone insisted, unable to explain himself, unable to apologize, unable to do one single thing except lie there under the frost and let the whole town keep believing exactly what they'd always believed about him. I asked him, standing there, the question I couldn't ask anyone living. I asked him if he'd love her, or if it had simply been convenience and proximity, and 11 weeks of a man's absence doing what absence always eventually does to a house left unattended. I asked him if he'd looked at Denny all those years at the station, all those birthdays and Little League games and welding certifications, and felt something he had no right to feel and no way to name out loud. I asked him what exactly a dead man thought he owed a living one for carrying his children for 21 years without knowing it. The stone did not answer. Stones never do. That is, I understood finally, standing on that cold hillside with my hands jammed in my coat pockets, the entire unbearable shape of what had happened to me, that the one person on this earth who might have explained any of it, who might have stood in front of me and let me see whatever guilt or love or cowardice had actually driven him had taken every answer with him into that fire 15 years ago, and left me standing here instead with nothing but a heroic epitaph and a boy who laughed with his hands. I thought standing there about the man I had actually known for 20 years before any of this, not the hero on the plaque, but the specific ordinary Emmett who used to bring me coffee at 3 in the morning on slow shifts, who cried without embarrassment at his own mother's funeral, who once drove 40 minutes out of his way to help me jump a dead battery on a night colder than this one. I could not reconcile that man with the one who had apparently sat across my own kitchen table for 2 decades, carrying a secret large enough to bury us both. Perhaps that is simply what a secret does to a man over enough years. It doesn't replace who he actually is. It just runs alongside him, silent the whole time, until somebody else finally finds the thread. I do not know how long I stood there. Long enough that my feet went numb inside my boots, long enough that the gray sky started spitting the first thin flakes of an early snow that wouldn't stick. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that too, because I have read enough about grief to know men are supposed to at some point, and I simply didn't, not there, not yet. What I felt instead was something closer to exhaustion, the specific, bone-deep exhaustion of a man who has spent 30 years demanding the truth from burned buildings and has just discovered that the truth, once you finally have it whole, doesn't actually put anything out. I drove home a little after noon and found Junie at the kitchen table alone, books spread out around her, a college essay draft open on her laptop that she wasn't actually looking at. She looked up when I came in and studied my face the particular way she's done since she was small, the way that used to make me proud, watching her learn to read a room the way I do. It did not make me proud that afternoon. It made me want to leave the kitchen entirely. "You've been weird for like 2 weeks," she said, not unkindly, closing her laptop halfway. "You and Mom both. You disappear for days and come back looking like somebody died, and nobody's telling me anything, and I'm not a little kid anymore, Dad." She said it steady the way she says most things, but I caught the small tremor underneath it, the fear a smart kid carries when she knows she's circling something true and can't yet see the shape of it. I stood in the doorway, with my coat still on, snow melting slowly off my shoulders onto the kitchen floor, and felt the whole weight of that stone on the hillside settle down on top of everything else I was already carrying. I wanted more than I have wanted almost anything in my life, to sit down across from her and tell her the truth, the way I'd have told it to any family, standing in the wreckage of a house I'd just finished investigating, plainly, completely, with whatever comfort I could offer alongside it. I could not make myself do it. Not there, not with her essay still glowing unfinished on the screen behind her. Not on a random Sunday afternoon, with no time built around it to hold what would come after. "You're right," I told her. "There's something going on. It's not about you, and it's not anything you did, and I promise you're going to hear it from me when I've got it steady enough to say right." I watched something in her face fight between relief and disappointment, the exact expression I imagine I'd worn 100 times myself over the last 2 weeks. "Not yet," I said, "but soon. I promise you that." She nodded slowly, not satisfied, not fooled, but willing for the moment to let me have the mercy of a little more time. I climbed the stairs to change out of my wet boots and stood in the upstairs hallway a long moment afterward, listening to her go back to typing below me, thinking that I had just done to my own daughter the exact thing Corinne had done to me for 21 years, asked her to keep living inside a house whose true shape she couldn't yet see. I wrote the speech over 4 nights, sitting at the marshal's office desk after hours, with the door locked, filling 3 legal pads with drafts I tore up almost as fast as I filled them. I told myself each night that I was simply organizing the facts, the same discipline I'd bring to any report, laying out a timeline, letting the record speak for itself. I have told myself a great many things over the past 3 weeks that were technically true and entirely dishonest about what they were actually for. On the second night, I called Corinne, the first time either of us had spoken since the kitchen, and told her flatly what I was drafting. I expected her to beg me not to. She didn't. She was quiet a long moment on the other end of the line, and then she said only that she couldn't stop me and wouldn't try, but that whatever I decided to do, I should do it, because it was right and not because it would hurt her the most. That surprised me more than almost anything else that whole month. That even now, even after everything, she still seemed to know exactly which parts of me needed saying out loud. The occasion presented itself the way these things sometimes do, arriving. Before I was ready and demanding I decide who I wanted to be. Before I'd finished deciding it in private. The town council had scheduled a vote on funding a permanent bronze statue of Emmett for the square outside the courthouse Wallace's fallen son cast in metal, standing forever at the corner of Bank and Cedar, where every tourist and every schoolchild would pass him for the next 100 years. Public comment was open. Anyone in Wallace could stand up at that podium and speak for 3 minutes on the record, and the record once made does not go quietly back into a drawer. I told myself I was going for the same reason half the town would be there. Civic duty, a man with standing in the fire community, weighing in on how it memorializes its own. I brought the folder. I brought the final draft, 4 paragraphs, typed clean, every fact in it, verifiable, every sentence in it, true. I sat in the 3rd row of the courthouse annex that Thursday night with that paper folded in my coat pocket, watching neighbor after neighbor stand up and speak with real feeling about a man they believed, without one flicker of doubt, deserved a statue. Old Hollis spoke about the ladder truck rescue in '98. A woman I half recognized from the auxiliary talked about the food drives Emmett had organized every winter for families hit hard by mine layoffs. A young man, maybe 25, stood up and said, voice cracking, that Emmett Cole was the reason he'd become a firefighter himself, that men like that didn't come along twice in a generation. The council members nodded along, moved, the vote already a formality in everyone's mind, before it was even called. I felt something in my chest tighten with every testimonial, a pressure building the exact way pressure builds inside a structure fire right before flashover, that specific point where a room goes from merely burning to consuming everything in it all at once. I thought about standing up. I ran the opening line of my own speech through my head a dozen times, while that boy talked about becoming a firefighter because of a man who was in ways this whole room would never understand. Not remotely who they believed him to be. I thought about the particular silence that would fall over that annex the moment I opened my mouth and started reading dates off a duty roster instead of praise off a eulogy. Some part of me, I will admit, wanted exactly that silence. I had spent 3 weeks being the only person in Wallace who understood what this town's hero had actually done. And there is a specific ugly satisfaction in imagining the moment everyone else finally has to understand it too. The moment the whole comfortable story cracks open in front of witnesses, and every person who ever said heart of gold has to sit with what that phrase actually cost. I am not proud of how badly I wanted that room to feel for even 30 seconds, a fraction of what I had been carrying alone since a lab report changed the shape of my own life. The council chair called the next name on the public comment sign-up sheet. Mine. I stood up. I remember the paper in my hand, the particular weight of it, 4 paragraphs of true things arranged in an order specifically built to detonate. I remember walking the short distance to the podium with a steadiness that surprised even me. 30 years of standing in front of hostile rooms, delivering hard findings, carrying me forward on pure muscle memory. I remember setting the paper down on the podium and looking out at the room to find my place before I began. That's when I saw him, Denny sitting near the back, having come. I understood in that instant, not for me, not out of any awareness of what I was about to do, but simply because Hollis had asked him along, because Denny liked the old man and liked hearing his fire department stories, because my son had spent his whole life quietly absorbing the idea that showing up for your community was just something a Larkin did without being asked twice. He was looking at me with an open, uncomplicated pride on his face. The exact look he'd worn clapping at the memorial 3 weeks earlier, ready to hear his father say something worth being proud of. I do not know how long I stood there with my hand flat on that paper, the room waiting, the council chair, glancing at her watch. I know that I looked at Denny's face and saw superimposed over it, the way a double exposure lays one photograph over another, every version of what would happen to that face in the next 4 minutes if I read a single word of what I'd brought. I saw it collapse. I saw the particular kind of collapse that doesn't come back from a public room, the kind that happens in front of witnesses and therefore can never be quietly rebuilt in private, the kind I would be responsible for causing. In the one place, a boy should never have to learn something like this. A folding chair in a courthouse annex, surrounded by strangers, no time to fall apart privately before the whole town watched him try to stand back up. I folded the paper. I told the council, my voice steadier than I had any right to expect, that I had intended to speak, but found I had nothing to add that hadn't already been said better by the people before me, and that Emmett Cole's memory was without question one this town should keep. I said it looking directly at Denny, not at the council, and watched the pride in his face hold steady instead of breaking, and understood. Walking back to my seat, past a room that had no idea what had almost happened in it, that I had just made the first choice in 3 weeks that had nothing to do with evidence at all. The vote passed unanimously 20 minutes later. I clapped along with everyone else. Whatever this was going to cost me eventually, I had decided, sitting in that folding chair with an unread speech going soft with sweat in my coat pocket, that it was not going to be paid for by burning my son down in a public room to settle a score with a dead man who couldn't even feel it land. Saturday came, the first one in 3 weeks, that didn't carry some scheduled reckoning attached to it. No hospital, no memorial, no council vote, no cemetery. I woke to the sound of Denny's truck engine turning over cleanly in the driveway, the same stubborn belt he'd been chasing since the very first pages of all this. Finally quiet, finally right. I lay in bed a moment, listening to it, idle, smooth, and felt something in my chest ease for the first time in what felt like a very long while. I went out in my coat, over pajama pants, coffee in hand, and found Denny leaning against the open hood, grinning like he'd solved something bigger than a fan belt. "Told you it wasn't the tensioner," he said, which wasn't remotely what I'd told him 3 weeks ago, but I let him have it, because a father lets a son have small victories, even when the record doesn't quite support the boy's version of events. He asked if I wanted to take it for a drive, hear how quiet it ran now. I said I would. We drove out past the edge of town on the old mining road. Windows cracked, despite the cold, and neither of us said much of anything for the better part of 20 minutes. That is, I have come to understand, one of the particular gifts of raising a boy. Rather than simply talking at him, that silence between us has never once felt like distance. It felt that morning like exactly the opposite. Denny hummed along to something on the radio, off-key in a way that would have embarrassed him at 15, and no longer did at 21. and I watched him out of the corner of my eye. This young man who did not carry one drop of my blood, and who had somehow, without either of us choosing it consciously, become built out of the same materials I was built out of: patient hands, a habit of checking twice, a stubbornness about doing a job right that I would have sworn 3 weeks ago only passed down through a bloodline. Somewhere past the old Hercules mind turnoff, Denny asked out of nowhere whether I remembered teaching him to drive stick in this exact truck's predecessor, out on this exact road the summer he turned 16. I did remembered it better than he probably realized, the way he'd stalled it 11 times in the first mile, and refused stubbornly to let me take the wheel back even once, insisting he'd get it before we turned around. He'd gotten it eventually, the same way he got everything, through sheer bullheaded persistence rather than any natural gift for it. I told him I remembered every stall. He laughed, said he was better now, and asked if I wanted to switch seats and find out. I said maybe another day, and meant it as a promise rather than a deflection, which felt in that truck like a small private miracle. Junie was waiting on the porch when we got back, a fishing rod in each hand, mine, and the child-sized one I'd bought her the summer she turned 7, still somehow in working order after 11 years, in the garage. She said she'd found them cleaning out the shed for Mom, and did I want to go down to the river before it got too cold to bother. I could have said no. I had every reason that particular week to say no to almost anything that asked me to keep being an ordinary father in an ordinary life. I no longer entirely trusted the foundation of. I said yes. We fished for 2 hours at the bend below the old trestle bridge, catching nothing worth keeping, which has never once been the point of fishing with Junie. She talked the whole time easy and unguarded about her college essay about a boy in her chemistry class. She wasn't sure she liked or just found interesting about a memory from when she was small. Me teaching her to cast patient through probably 40 tangled lines before she got it right, never once raising my voice the way she'd heard other fathers raise theirs at other kids on that same riverbank. You never got mad, she said, reeling in slack, even when I was terrible at it. I told her I never once thought of her as terrible at anything, and meant it entirely, and felt something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with anger at all. She asked a while later whether I thought she should study conservation, like she'd been planning, or switch to something more practical, the way one of her guidance counselors had suggested, something with better job prospects, less competition. I told her the world had plenty of practical people in it already, and precious few who cared enough about rivers like this one to spend a whole career protecting them, and that I'd rather see her broke and doing work she loved than comfortable and quietly resentful of a life she'd talked herself into. She went quiet a moment, turning that over, then said that was probably the nicest thing I'd said to her all year, which struck me harder than she could have known, given everything I hadn't been saying to her all year, for reasons that had nothing to do with her at all. I sat on that riverbank with my line slack in the current, watching my daughter's face in the gray afternoon light, and understood not as an idea the way I'd understood things all month through evidence and timelines and duty rosters, but as a plain physical fact settling into my body that whatever biology had or hadn't done 21 years ago, I was the one who had taught her to cast a line. I was the one who had sat up with her through fevers, who had walked her through every hard year of school, who had built patiently over 18 years, whatever it was that made her trust me enough to bring me down to this river on a Saturday. She didn't have to give me at all. Blood had made a claim on my life it never once asked my permission for. It had not, I understood, finally made a single one of the things that actually mattered. I thought about the folded speech I had carried and not delivered at the courthouse, about the anger that had driven me to write it, about how much of that anger had been if I was honest with myself, less about protecting these two people and more about wanting somebody, anybody, to finally feel a fraction of what I'd been carrying alone. Watching Junie cast her line clean and easy into the current, I understood that using the truth as a weapon would not settle a single debt Emmett Cole owed me. It would only spend the one thing I actually had left standing, the trust these two kids still carried for me, unearned by blood, and paid for instead in 18 and 21 years of Saturdays exactly like this one. Denny reeled in his own empty line further downstream and called out that we should head back before dark. And Junie laughed and told him he was just mad. He hadn't caught anything either. I sat there another moment before I stood watching the two of them pack up the gear together, easy and familiar, entirely unaware that their father had just made in total silence on a riverbank the one decision that mattered most of everything I'd decided that whole month. I was going to tell them the truth. Not to punish anyone, and not to unburden myself of a weight I had chosen alone to keep carrying a little longer. I was going to tell them because they deserved to walk into whatever came next of their lives, standing on solid ground, the way I would want any family walking out of any house I'd ever investigated, to finally know exactly what they were standing on. I found Corinne on a Tuesday evening home from the History Center, sitting alone at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, going cold in front of her, the same table, the same chair. Though I noticed she'd moved to sit on my old side of it, as if some part of her had already started rearranging the house around the shape of my absence. She looked up when I came in, and didn't say anything at first, just watched me cross the room and sit down across from her, in what used to be her seat, in a house that no longer quite belonged to either of us the way it once had. "I've decided some things," I said. "I wanted you to hear them from me before I say them to Denny and Junie." She nodded slowly, folding her hands around the cooling mug, and I could see her bracing for something, though I don't think she knew yet which direction the blow was coming from. I told her first, the smaller decisions that I'd already spoken to the county about scaling back my consulting hours, that I'd asked Hollis to look in on the house and the truck, while I figured out what came next. Small practical things that felt laid out one after another on that table like a man reading off the contents of an evidence bag before he says anything about what the evidence actually means. Corinne listened to all of it without interrupting, the way she'd learned to listen to me over 23 years, letting me build toward whatever I'd actually come to say before she asked a single question. I told her I was going to tell them the truth. All of it, the roster, the photographs, Emmett, everything. But that I wasn't going to do it as an accusation against her, and I wasn't going to let it become a trial with her as the defendant in her own kitchen. I told her the kids deserved the facts plainly stated without either of us performing grief or guilt at them, and that whatever came after belonged to the three of them to work out, not to me to control from the outside. She let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since I sat down. "And after that," I said, "I think I need to leave Wallace for a while." She went very still. Not the collapsed stillness of that first night in this kitchen, something quieter, more prepared, like she had already run this exact conversation in her head enough times that the actual words landed somewhere she'd built room for in advance. "For how long?" she asked, and I told her the truth, which was that I honestly didn't know. Long enough to remember how to trust my own red on a room again. Long enough that coming home to Wallace didn't mean walking past a bronze statue of a man I'd have to keep pretending I only grieved simply. "I'm not leaving to punish you," I told her, and I meant it as plainly as I have ever meant anything. I've thought about whether that's really what this is, and I don't believe it is. I think I need somewhere that isn't stitched all the way through with 23 years of a story I now have to read differently. I can't do that work standing in this kitchen. I've tried. I stood right here 3 weeks ago, and I haven't been able to do it since. She asked very quietly if I still loved her. It was the only question in that entire conversation that came close to begging, and even that she asked it plainly, without tears in her voice, like a woman asking for a fact rather than a rescue. I told her the truth, because I owed her that much after 23 years, whatever else I owed her or didn't. I told her I did, that I thought I probably always would, and that loving her had stopped sometime in the last 3 weeks, being the same thing as being able to stay. She did not argue with that. She did not tell me I was making a mistake or ask me to reconsider or offer any version of the bargaining I had half expected. Walking in the door, more time, more silence, a slower unwinding that might let us both pretend a little longer. She sat with her hands around that cold mug of tea and said only that she understood and that she wouldn't fight me on it, because she had spent 21 years already deciding over and over what I got to know about my own life, and she wasn't going to spend whatever years came next deciding what I was allowed to do about it. I'll tell them I'm sorry, she said, in whatever way you think is right. I'll say whatever you need me to say, or nothing at all, if that's better. I told her that wasn't something I could decide for her, that the version of this the kids needed to hear from their mother wasn't mine to script. And I watched something in her face settle at that, a small, hard-won relief at being handed back one piece of this that was still entirely her own to carry. We sat a while longer without saying much else. I noticed the way I notice everything, even now, that she never once reached for my hand across that table, never once asked me to stay the night in a spare room to think it over, never once did any of the things a person does when they still believe there's a version of pleading that might work. I understood, watching her sit so still and so contained, that she had made her own kind of peace with this loss. Somewhere in the 11 days before I even confronted her, that some part of her had been grieving me since the night Denny needed a blood transfusion, long before I knew there was anything to grieve. I stood up eventually, the way I'd stood up in this same kitchen 3 weeks before, and this time she walked me to the door instead of letting me leave in silence. She didn't hug me. She put her hand briefly on my arm just above the elbow, the way she used to before I left for a long shift, an old gesture worn smooth by 23 years of repetition, and said only, "Drive safe." The same 2 words she'd said to me 1,000 times before, meaning them now in a way that had nothing simple left in it at all. I walked out to the truck and got in and did not start the engine. I sat there in the driveway with both hands resting on the wheel, the porch light behind me throwing my own shadow long across the dashboard, and did not move for what must have been 20 minutes, though I could not have told you at the time whether it was 5 or 50. I did not cry, not exactly, though something in my chest kept threatening the shape of it without ever quite arriving. I sat with my hands on a wheel. I had no intention of turning yet in a driveway I had pulled into 10,000 times across 23 years, and let myself finally feel the entire weight of everything I had spent a month refusing to put down. I asked them both to sit down with me the next evening in the living room, rather than the kitchen, some instinct telling me the kitchen table had already carried enough weight for this family and deserved, at least for tonight, to be spared one more thing. Corinne stayed upstairs by agreement, close enough to come down if either of them needed her, and far enough away that they could hear this first, if only once entirely from me. Denny sat on the arm of the couch, not quite settling into it the way he does when he already senses something's wrong, and hasn't decided yet whether sitting properly would make it worse. Junie curled into the armchair across from him, knees pulled up, watching me with the same careful attention she'd been giving me for weeks. The attention of someone who has been waiting for a shoe to drop, and would rather it just drop already then keep hovering. I did not build up to it the way I might have built up a report laying groundwork, softening a room before the hard finding lands in the middle of it. I have learned delivering hard news for 30 years that the softening rarely helps the person receiving it. It mostly helps the person delivering it feel less responsible for the blow. I owed my own children better than that. I had rehearsed this moment more times than I could count over the previous 3 weeks, standing alone in the marshal's kitchenette. Driving the long way home from consults, lying awake on that cot, listening to the radiator. Every version I'd built collapsed the moment I actually looked at their two faces waiting for me to start. Denny's careful stillness, Junie's wide, bracing eyes, because no rehearsed version of a sentence like this one survives contact with the people who actually have to receive it. I understood, sitting down across from them, that I was simply going to have to say it plainly and let the room absorb it however it needed to. 3 weeks ago, I said, I found out something about our family that changes some of what you both thought you knew, and I need to tell you myself plainly instead of letting you hear pieces of it secondhand. I watched Denny's jaw tighten, the exact motion I'd watched 100 times on him as a boy bracing for bad news about a game he'd lost, or a friend who'd moved away, grown up now, into something heavier. Junie went very still in the armchair, the way she goes still before anything, watching, cataloging the way I taught her without meaning to. I told them about the blood test, the cross-match at the hospital, the DNA results that came back 3 weeks ago, confirming neither of them shared blood with me. I watched that land, watched Denny's hand come up to rub the back of his own neck, that same gesture. Emmett's gesture that had first cracked this whole thing open for me at the memorial, entirely unaware of what it was doing even now. I told them as gently and as plainly as I knew how that their biological father had been Emmett Cole. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I heard the refrigerator cycle on in the kitchen, ordinary machinery running underneath the most extraordinary conversation of any of our lives. Junie spoke first, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. Does Mom know you know? I told her yes, that Corinne and I had talked, that none of what I was telling them was news to her, and that she would talk to them too, whenever they were ready to hear whatever she needed to say in her own words. Junie asked, after another long moment, whether I'd known Emmett well, whether the man in all those photographs at the memorial, the one this whole town had spent 15 years mourning, was someone I'd actually liked before any of this. I told her the truth, that yes, I had for 20 years before I'd ever known there was a second secret version of him running alongside the one I thought I knew. She nodded slowly at that, like it mattered to her that the answer wasn't simple hatred, that I could still hold two true things about the same dead man at once. I think, looking back, that was the moment I understood she was going to be all right eventually, even if eventually was still a long way off. Denny stood up and walked to the window back to the room and stayed there a long moment without speaking. When he finally turned around, his eyes were wet in a way I had not seen since he was maybe 9 years old, and his voice, when it came, was rougher than I'd ever heard it. So, none of it's real, he said. 21 years of you teaching me stuff, all of it. He couldn't finish the sentence. I did not let him finish it. It's the realest thing in my life, I told him, and meant it with every part of me I had left standing. Blood didn't teach you to feel for a belt with your eyes closed instead of your hands. I did that. Blood didn't sit up with you through your fevers, or stand in that gymnasium proud enough to burst watching you graduate the welding program. I did that too, and I'd do every single hour of it again, exactly the same, knowing everything I know now. You are my son, Denny. That was never once a question I needed a lab to answer for me, and it still isn't. Junie was crying quietly in the armchair by then. Not loud, just steady tears. She wasn't bothering to wipe away, and I moved to sit on the ottoman in front of her, close enough that she could see my face clearly. "I know this feels like the ground moved," I told her. "I felt that too the night I found out. But I want you to hear this part as clearly as I can say it. Nothing about who I am to you has changed. I am still exactly the father who taught you to cast a line at that river. And I always will be, whether a laboratory agrees with that or not." She reached out and took my hand, the first time either of them had touched me since I'd started talking, and held on hard enough that I understood she needed the physical fact of me more than she needed any more words right then. Denny came and sat back down on the couch properly this time, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor, quiet in a way that wasn't rejection, I understood. So much as a boy trying to find somewhere solid to stand inside news that had just moved every wall in the house he thought he knew. Nobody said much else that night. I did not push either of them toward forgiveness or understanding or anything at all beyond simply hearing it. Because I have learned that grief this size cannot be rushed into any tidy shape on the same evening it arrives. I sat with them a long while in that quiet living room, Junie's hand still in mine. Denny's eyes still fixed on some spot on the carpet, all three of us breathing the same air of a house that had just been permanently, irrevocably rearranged, and understood that whatever came next between us would take longer than one honest conversation to build. But it would be built on something true now, at least. That was the only gift I had left to give either of them, and I gave it to them plainly, the way I would have wanted if our positions had somehow been reversed for someone to have given it to me. I woke before dawn the next morning, the way I always do before a long drive, and spent an hour in the garage packing what I actually needed into the bed of the truck. Not much in the end, when a man sits down and counts what a life actually requires versus what it simply accumulates. My tools. A few changes of clothes. The old case notebook which I packed last, setting it carefully on the passenger seat where I could reach it. Because some habits a man doesn't leave behind, even when he's leaving almost everything else. I stood for a moment before I closed up the tailgate, looking at the garage itself. The workbench where Denny and I had chased that stubborn belt for the better part of a month. The pegboard of tools arranged in the order I'd arranged them for 20 years. The particular slant of early light through the one window that faces east. A man spends 30 years reading other people's houses for what they reveal, and it took losing this one in every sense but the literal to understand how much of my own life had been written into a room I'd never once thought to read carefully. Denny found me out there a little after 6, still in his sleep clothes, hair every direction, the way he used to look, padding down for breakfast as a boy. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in the garage doorway, watching me coil the last extension cord and set it in its place. And I let him watch because I understood he needed a minute before whatever he'd come out here to say. "You're actually leaving," he said finally. Not a question. I told him yes for a while, not forever, and that I needed him to hear that distinction clearly, because I could see in his face he was already building the version where this was permanent, the way a man braces for the worst outcome, so the actual outcome, whatever it turns out to be, can't catch him unprepared. I have done the same thing myself, more times than I could count. I set down the cord and crossed the garage and put both hands on his shoulders the way I used to when he was small enough that this gesture meant something different, steadying him before a big moment, a first day of school, a first solo drive. "I need you to hear this exactly once clearly before I go," I told him. "There has not been a single day in 21 years I wasn't your father. Not one. Whatever I need to go work out about myself doesn't put a single mark against that. You understand me? He nodded, jaw working, and then he did something he hadn't done since he was maybe 12 years old. He stepped in and hugged me hard, the way boys stop doing somewhere around 13 and rarely start again without a reason like this one. Junie came down while we were still standing there wrapped in a blanket against the cold and waited until Denny stepped back before she came and did the same thing, quieter about it. Her face pressed for a moment against my coat, the way it used to when she was small enough to be carried in from the car asleep. "You'll call," she said. Not really a question either. And I told her every week more if she wanted, and that I expected a full report on that acceptance portal the moment it finally stopped taunting her. Corinne stood in the doorway to the kitchen, not coming out into the cold, watching the three of us from a distance that felt I understood, deliberately chosen her own quiet way of letting this last morning belong to me and the kids, without inserting herself into a goodbye. She'd already had her turn at 3 nights before, at that kitchen table. I caught her eye across the driveway and nodded once, and she nodded back. And that was the whole of it between us that morning. Everything that needed saying already said. I loaded the last box into the truck bed and checked the tie-downs twice the way I check everything twice. And Denny and Junie stood together on the porch steps in the cold, not going back inside yet watching me finish. I walked back up to them one more time before I climbed in because I found I wasn't ready yet for the version of goodbye where I simply drove away. Denny asked, hesitant in a way that wasn't like him, whether I had somewhere specific I was headed or whether I was just driving until somewhere felt right. I told him the truth that I had a cousin outside Missoula who'd offered a spare room more than once over the years and never once needed a real reason attached to the offer, and that I'd start there and see what the ground felt like under my feet after a while. He nodded slowly, filing it away. The careful way he files away anything mechanical, a fact he could hold on to a location he could picture me inside of instead of just a vague direction on a map. "Take care of the belt on that truck," I told Denny, nodding toward his own vehicle parked in its usual spot. "I mean it. Don't let it go another 3 weeks past when it starts talking to you." He laughed wet-eyed and real and told me he would. And I believed him the way I have always believed him about anything mechanical, because that particular kind of trust, at least, had never once needed a lab report to confirm it. I told Junie one more time that whatever school took her, whatever river ended up needing her more than this one did, I would be there however far I had to drive to make it happen. She nodded, blanket pulled tight around her shoulders against the cold, and told me to be careful on the mountain roads. The same thing her mother used to say to me every fire season for 23 years. And I understood, hearing it come out of my daughter's mouth instead, that some things really do pass down a family, whether blood carries them or not. I climbed into the truck and started the engine and sat there one more moment with my hand on the gear shift, looking at the two of them standing on the porch of the only house either of them had ever called home. Corinne, a step behind them in the doorway, the whole shape of the family I had spent 23 years building framed there in my rearview mirror one last time before I pulled out of that driveway. I drove out of Wallace the way I'd driven it 1,000 times down Bank Street, past the firehouse, past the courthouse, where a bronze statue would stand within the year, past the cemetery gate, where a stone would go right on, saying he gave everything he had, whether I forgave it or not. I took the long climb up into the mountains, where the road switches back on itself 3 times before it clears the ridge. And somewhere near the top, I looked in the mirror one last time and watched the whole valley, the town, the river, the house I'd built a life inside of, without ever once checking its foundation, fold itself slowly out of sight behind the shoulder of the mountain, smaller and smaller, until there was nothing back there but road and pine and the particular gray light of an Idaho morning that didn't care one way or another what any of us had just survived. 4 years passed, or near enough, before I looked up from the porch of a small rented house outside Missoula one Saturday afternoon and saw Denny's truck, his own truck. Now the transmission, long since rebuilt twice over by his own hands, pull up along the gravel shoulder of a road that had over those 4 years slowly become the road that led to something I could finally call home again. I had built a quiet life in those years, the kind I don't think I could have built inside Wallace, even if I'd stayed and fought for the right to. I still consulted, still walked into the occasional burned structure, and read what the char had to say. But mostly for a smaller county now at a smaller pace, with time in between, to sit on this porch and watch weather move across the valley the way I used to watch weather move across a scene before I let myself draw any conclusions. I had, somewhere in that quiet, mostly stopped waiting for the ground to shift again. Corinne and I spoke on the phone most months, careful and civil, mostly about the kids, occasionally about nothing at all, the particular easy silence of two people who had once known each other completely and now knew each other only in careful installments. She'd sold the house in Wallace 2 years back, moved into something smaller near the History Center, and told me once in one of those quiet calls that she still visited Emmett's grave sometimes. Not out of anything she could fully explain, just an old habit of grief that hadn't found a reason to stop yet. I did not begrudge her that. I had my own version of the same habit out here in the shape of a notebook I still carried and rarely opened. I did not know they were coming. That was, I understood, the moment I saw the truck slow at my mailbox, exactly the point they had driven 6 hours without calling ahead. Because some conversations Denny told me later, standing in my driveway, you don't want to give a person the chance to prepare a version of themselves for. Denny got out, first 25, now broader through the shoulders, then I remembered a wedding band on his hand that I hadn't yet seen in person. Only in the photograph he'd texted me the week after the courthouse ceremony he and his fiancée had chosen instead of the big wedding. Neither of them wanted. Junie came around the other side, 22, finishing up a graduate program in river conservation, 2 states over. Exactly the work she'd told me about on that riverbank the last ordinary Saturday we'd ever had together in Wallace. I stood up off the porch steps slower than I used to, and for a moment none of us said anything at all, the 3 of us standing in a gravel driveway in the long gold light of a Montana afternoon, taking the measure of 4 years of phone calls and holiday visits that had never quite been enough to close the distance a person can only close standing in the same patch of dirt as the people they love. Denny spoke first. He said he was sorry, not for anything that had happened in that kitchen 4 years ago, none of which was ever his to apologize for, but for the 1.5 years after, when his calls had gotten shorter, when he'd let the strangeness of everything crowd out the plain fact that I was still exactly the same father who'd taught him to feel for a belt with his eyes closed. He said he understood now, watching his own new marriage find its footing, how much harder it must have been for me to leave than it had ever looked from the porch that morning I'd driven away, and that he wished he'd called more, visited more, made it easier instead of just waiting for enough time to pass, that it stopped being complicated. I told him there was nothing to apologize for, that grief this size doesn't move on anybody's schedule, least of all a young man's, and that I had never once counted the calls against him, not for a single day of those 4 years. Junie stepped in, then tears already starting the way they always had for her, easier than for her brother, and said she'd felt the same thing, that some nights in her first year of grad school she'd catch herself furious at a dead man she'd never even properly known, furious at her mother. Furious at a version of the world that had rearranged itself under her without asking, and that some of that fury had unfairly landed on the distance between us instead of anywhere it actually belonged. She told me about a professor she had that first semester, an old field ecologist who'd lost his own father young, and always said that grief doesn't travel in a straight line, that it circles back on people at strange hours, in strange shapes and lands, on whoever happens to be standing closest, rather than whoever actually deserves it. She said she'd thought about that lecture more than any other in 2 years of graduate work, turning it over on long drives on sleepless nights, slowly working out that the man who deserved her anger had never once been standing anywhere she could reach him, and that I had simply been closest. "You don't owe me an apology either," I told her, and meant it entirely. "You were 18 years old and the ground moved. I'd have been angry at somebody too." She shook her head anyway, the same stubborn set to her jaw I'd watched her wear over a fishing rod 100 times, and said she'd come, they'd both come, because she didn't want one more year to pass with any of it left unsaid between us. Not the anger, not the distance, not the plain fact that whatever a laboratory had once decided about the two of them, I was still and had always been exactly what I told them I was that night in the living room. Her father. I did not say anything else after that. I opened my arms instead the way I used to when they were small enough to run the length of a porch and land against me without warning, and Denny came first, and then Junie, and for a long moment, the three of us stood there in that gravel driveway, holding on the way. People hold on when 4 years of careful distance finally admit they were never as necessary as anybody thought. Nobody said anything more. Nobody needed to. I stood there with my son and my daughter in the gold light of a Montana afternoon, and understood finally fully in a way no lab report and no duty roster had ever been able to give me exactly what a family is actually built out of. We stood there a long while before anyone thought to go inside. When we finally did, Denny made coffee the way I'd taught him too strong, and Junie pulled out her laptop to show me photographs from a river restoration project 2 states over, and for a few hours that afternoon, we were simply a family. Again sitting around a kitchen table that had nothing to confess and nothing left to hide. Corinne remarried the following spring, a quiet man from the county extension office, gentle in the way she'd always deserved, and rarely gotten from either of the 2 men who'd shared her life before him. She still keeps the picnic photographs. She told me once she'd stopped needing to explain them to anyone, including herself. The bronze statue still stands at the corner of Bank and Cedar, and children still climb on its base for photographs. And I have made my peace with the fact that Wallace will keep its hero exactly as it always knew him, because a town's memory and a family's truth were never obligated to match. I think now that I spent 30 years believing a man could investigate his way to safety, that enough evidence gathered carefully enough would finally close a case so completely that nothing could ever again catch him off guard. I know better now. Some rooms don't close. You simply learn to live in them differently, the way I learned to live in the knowledge that the 2 people I love most in this world came into my life through someone else's silence and became mine anyway. Through nothing but 20 years of ordinary Tuesdays, nobody thought to document. A dead man cannot apologize. A dead man cannot explain himself or beg forgiveness or stand in a kitchen and take responsibility for what his silence cost the people he claimed to love. I used to think that meant a dead man owed a debt that could never be collected. I don't think that anymore. I think the debt was never his to pay in the first place. It was mine to 2 children who never asked to be anyone's evidence and who taught me standing in a gravel driveway 4 years later. that love was never once the thing in question. It was the only thing that was never in question at all. If you've ever raised a child who wasn't fully yours by blood, or discovered later than you'd have liked exactly what family is actually built out of, I'd like to hear how you found your way through it. And if there's someone in your life you've been meaning to call, maybe don't wait for the ground to move